playing the same format over and over and over again, you flush the format out pretty good. And generally what you're going to find is that certain decks are going to rise to the top. Now, even in a format like RS to PK with such a wide card pool, sometimes decks become, I would say, almost too good or oppressive. And you're always going to have top decks, but I think it's a pretty large margin on how much those decks gatekeep or oppress other decks from being playable. And one of the things too that's been talked about to help keep the format fresh, to help keep things interesting, is to rotate certain cards in or out of the card pool, just so, one, it allows other decks to kind of come into play, and at the same time too, maybe help deal with some of the more oppressive decks in the format. And RS to PK has a lot of really oppressive decks. So today I'm going to take a look at what I would say would be my top 5 cards that should be, I guess, in discussion for a possible ban from the RS to PK format, or maybe to run a couple of Sundays without them. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you agree with my choices? Do you disagree with my choices? How different is your list from my list? But let's go ahead and just jump right on into it here. So my first one is going to be POW hand extension. Now, I'm going to start off by saying that I don't think any card on my list is necessarily broken or bad. I'm going to say, though, that I think basically every card in the format on its own is perfectly fine. But when you start comboing it with other cards, that's when issues start arising. And I think POW hand extension is honestly a really well-designed card. The problem with it is that, how do I want to say this? I think come from behind cards are very good for the game in general. Cards like Scramble Energy, cards like POW, cards that force your opponent to really think if they want to take that prize, or how much trouble are they going to be in if they take that prize and say, for example, their Blastoise EX gets POW'd and knocked out. It creates a really interesting dynamic with with the gameplay. The problem with POW is that certain decks, such as Bombtar, can automatically force your opponent to go up in prizes. So it's not a choice of, well, I'm going to decide when POW gets activated. Your opponent is basically telling you when POW gets activated. And then on the opposite side of that, there is decks in the format like Rayquaza Stantler, which basically your opponent doesn't have a choice but to go up in prizes. Like, there's not really a prize exchange there. They'll basically just snipe around everything until you start taking prizes, and then they'll start doing the whole POW combo. So POW hand extension in a deck like LBS, for example, is, I think, perfectly fine and balanced, because there is a dynamic prize trade there, but it becomes more of a problem when either your opponent is forcing you to go up on prizes at a moment of their choosing, or B, that you're playing against certain decks where they're not designed to actually go up in prizes at all, and they'll sit there and basically just do very annoying things for a majority of the game, and then just quickly steal all their prizes at the very end. Those are going to be my issues with POW hand extension. Now, the next one is going to be Cursed Stone. And Cursed Stone is probably not on a bunch of people's, I would say, radar as far as one of the most broken cards in the RS PK format. Obviously, it's very good. My issue with Cursed Stone is kind of twofold. One, I think that Cursed Stone gatekeeps a lot of decks from being really, really good. A lot of very power-heavy decks struggle to deal with Cursed Stone. Cursed Stone is, I guess, one more card in kind of the tipping point of what makes it really hard for decks like Meta Knight, for example, to be incredibly good in the RS to PK format. My main issue with Cursed Stone is not Cursed Stone on its own, but the fact that Cursed Stone combined with other cards in the format like Cessation Crystal and Minim and things like that make it very, very hard for your opponent to deal with it, because they either have to answer the Cursed Stone or the cessation crystal. And a lot of smart players are not going to throw both down at the same time, or they're going to try to bait out windstorms at the start, or bait out like counter stadium, stuff like that. And it's one of those things where if players had to deal with just cessation crystal, I think it would be fine. And if players had to deal with just curse stone, I think it would be fine. But kind of a combination of the two makes certain decks like Rayquaza Stantler or Ryeeggs, for example, just very oppressive decks and very frustrating decks to play against. Third is going to be Stantler. Now, once again, on its own, I don't think Stantler is... I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world. It just... Stantler does a little bit of everything, and it does it right. 70 HP for a basic is pretty solid. The fact that it can deal with evolutions, making them confused, is really strong. And then the fact that it can start stripping away your opponent's hand is really good. You combine this with cards like Rocket's Admin, where you can basically put your opponent at, let's say, 3 or 4 cards, and then you strip away a supporter from their hand, is obviously going to be incredibly strong in a lot of situations. You combine this with cards like Cessation Crystal, where all of a sudden they have a much harder time answering it because they can't use powers. You put them at a small hand size. You took away literally the only good card they had in their hand. And then if you try to put pressure on the Stantler, they're just going to make you confused. It literally does everything right. I think if it had just Screechy Voice, it would be fine. If it had just push away as an attack, it would be fine. If it was weaker and easier to knock out, I think it would be fine. Or if Cessation Crystal didn't exist in the format, I think it would be fine. But it's just a combination of all of these different things, and it's just a whole bunch of little things it does right that make it, to be honest with you, a very oppressive card and very hard to deal with for a lot of decks in the format. All right, number 2 is going to be Sniff Out. Obviously, Minim is the number 1 culprit. It's the one that we see that sees the most play. However, if you ban Minim, then everyone's just going to play Electrike and probably start, comboing that with Manectric EX and stuff like that. Now, obviously, Electrike is a little bit weaker than Minim, but it's going to serve the same function or same purpose. And kind of going along with a lot of the things I've talked about, if your opponent only had to deal with a certain number of cards, like let's say they only had to deal with, they knew they only had to deal with 4 POWs, or they only had to deal with 4 Cessation Crystals or 4 Curse Stones, it would all be fine. The problem is, though, is that Minim and just basically Sniff Out lets you constantly recycle these cards, and you'll find a lot of the times one of the most annoying locks to be in is against, like, let's say Rayquaza Stantler, for example. You go up in prizes, they POW up something on your bench, Sniff Out, grab that POW back. And they just repeat that combo until you can no longer get out of it. And if they had kind of a finite number of resources, like you only had to deal with the 4 POWs or something like that, it would be completely fine. But it's the fact that over a course of a game, your opponent might play 8 POWs against you, 10 POWs against you, 12 POWs against you. It is just incredibly difficult to deal with basically unlimited resources. And the problem with that on top of that too is if they go Sniff Out, they POW, Sniff Out, grab POW back, unless you're instantly able to deal with that Minim on the following turn, they're going to Sniff Out another POW, Sniff Out another POW. They're just going to keep doing it because they'll make sure that you're not able to put pressure on them. You can't retreat out of it because those energies are going to constantly get POW'd. There's just nothing that you can do about it unless you have the right combination of cards in your hand to deal with it. On top of that, too, they're going to use cards like Cessation Crystal or Curse Stone to kind of get some of those to either control you or to get those that chip damage in. And it's such an overly powerful lock that there's just not a whole lot you can do about it. And it's incredibly frustrating for players to play against, especially new players to the format that don't fully know how to build their decks or to deal with it. And then lastly, the number 1 spot is going to be Cessation Crystal. While I think everything else in the format, all the first 4 cards that we dealt with are definitely oppressive cards, I think that by far the biggest problem is Cessation Crystal, because Cessation Crystal stops you from having or getting to the outs that'll help you deal with the first 4 cards. And if you would have access to Pidgeot, for example, it'd be much easier to deal with the first 4. If you had access to, let's say, If you're playing Meta Knight, you had access to Metagross. It would help you deal with the first 4. Stantler becomes a lot less oppressive. Pushaway becomes a lot less oppressive if you have powers on your bench that can help you get out of those current situations. And I think decks could be built much differently if they could have those guaranteed powers in a lot of situations. Now, like I said, on its own, Cessation Crystal is fine. It's just combined with the first 4 that it just becomes, in my opinion, the worst offender at what causes problems or what helps create these horrible and really difficult to deal with locks. So that's going to go ahead and wrap up my top 5. Let me know, do you agree with my choices? Do you disagree with my choices? Do you think a possible ban list for the RS to PK format would be helpful? Or do you think the format is doing all right on its own and doing stuff like this isn't really going to help expand the card pool at all? Just like I said, if you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and give me your thoughts down below. But of course, I hope to see you in the next